Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Troublesome Terps, the podcast about things that keep interpreters up at night. My name's Alexander Drexel. I'm an EU staff interpreter speaking here in a private capacity. It's probably bears repeating since I missed a couple of episodes, unfortunately, but Sarah and Alex were holding down the fort quite well. So let's welcome, first of all, Sarah Hickey. Good evening. How are you?
Hello. Yeah, I'm good. Glad to be back. And it was fun running the last few episodes just with the other Alex.
Yeah, with your favorite co-host, right?
With my favorite co-host. Yeah, I could only say that
yeah.
at the time. Yeah. Now both of you are my favorite co-hosts. But no, I also really miss Jonathan, but that's another story. Yeah. Anyway, glad to be here, also in a private capacity. But otherwise, in my daytime, I spend my time researching the language industry at NIMSY. And yeah, by night, I'm a podcaster here. So with my favorite colleague, the other Alex.
Yay, that would be me, right? So this is Alex Gansmeyer, always in a private capacity because that's all I have to offer. But yeah, always a pleasure to be here. I mean, I'd like to think it's enough. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think, Alex, today we have some very special co-hosts for today's show, don't we?
Indeed, we do. We have two guests that, we've been planning this for a long time, shall we just say, because it all started with a tweet or a Twitter conversation, actually, as many things do nowadays. So it's finally happening because the idea was to have a bit of a debate about a hot potato, a hot ticket item, namely artificial intelligence or whatever's being called that these days. So here they are, Professor Graham Turner and Henry Liu. Henry, I know from Twitter, of course. We also met in person a few times. Last time we met was at the ATA conference in 2016. That's been quite a while. I think back then you were still president of FIT, so the International Association of Interpreters and Translators, or associations thereof. And what are you doing these days, Henry?
Just like most people, just trying to find new ideas. I mean, the consulting part works pretty much the same, and doing a bit of writing. And now I'm podcasting.
That's true. We're very glad you are.
Only being interviewed, not good enough to be actually podcasting my ideas yet.
Well, that might come at a later point. But I was going to say, you're also an interpreter and translator. So do you still get to do any translation or interpreting at the moment?
Yes, absolutely. Thankfully, in the Antipodes, we finally get free movement and conferences are happening. And certainly, I mean, the day-to-day community interpreting absolutely still happening and had to be happening. But yes, face-to-face is alive in the Antipodes. The trans-hemispheric travel is still out of bounds so far.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So conference appearances hasn't happened yet. At the beginning of the pandemic, I decided not to accept any virtual appearances, being somebody who is advocating for visibility and the physical presence being very important for what we're doing. And particularly in the speaking capacity, I decided not to do that. But yeah, a few special requests I have done. Hopefully, we can all get back together and being actually physically face to face and actually having the vibe. And hopefully one day we can actually have this. What we were talking about at the beginning, the Troublesome Terp Roundtable live, where we have where we have real hot potatoes throwing out from the audience.
Actual physical hot potatoes and rotten tomatoes, possibly.
Exactly.
Yes. Also joining us from an undisclosed location, as I just said, is Professor Graham Turner. Welcome, Graham. It's lovely to be able to speak to you again. We had the pleasure of speaking quite a bit a few years ago about a topic that is very near and dear to your heart and my heart as well, about sign language and the BSL Act, which is not really the topic, although it might be tonight. I don't know. But the whole sort of Twitter conversation goes back, I think, to a talk you gave at the SUTI conference in 2018. As far as you can still recall, what was the main slant of that talk? What sparked the debate there?
It wasn't a talk, actually. It was a panel, an audience-initiated discussion, really, about a whole range of topics. And there was a particular focus at one stage on this question of the role of technologies and artificial intelligence in particular in the interpreting field. And I took the view at that point, and would still take the view, that we are generally underestimating the impact that is going to have in the relatively short term. But I won't go any further into that just now, because I think this discussion will evolve in the next wee while.
Spoiler alert!
Yeah. Keeping your cards close to the chest. So I'm wondering, Sarah, how are you looking at AI these days? During your work at NIMSY, I'm assuming that's a big topic, and of course, translation, as is often the case, is a bit ahead of interpreting in terms of technology adoption and machine translation, and tools built into CAT environments and so on. So, what have you picked up so far on the whole topic of AI and I guess natural language processing and so on?
Yeah, there's a lot happening in that field, and as you rightfully said, in translation, this is already further ahead because it's a bit easier in some sense to deal with the written word, and ideally also if something is already written and not changing all the time, even though there's been progress made there too. Machine translation is pretty much a staple these days, right? That it's being used in all sorts of forms. Actually, I just had a live stream earlier this week on Monday with one of my colleagues who talked about it was player-generated content in the gaming industry and specific machine translation engines that were developed for that, which is really tricky because there's a lot of jargon and slang, and basically gamers more or less speak their own language, and there's lots of references to memes, and it's changing all the time. But even there have been applications. There are applications now that can remove the need for human interaction. Of course, it's not perfect output, but it's good enough for this type of communication. And there's lots and lots of need in that field. So I went a little bit off topic there now, but actually I was really surprised when I first looked into AI and interpreting. Well, actually there's two fields, right? On the one hand, we have machine interpreting, and then you have something like computer assisted interpreting tools, the Kai tools, the famous ones, right? I think this is something that we will see very, very soon, and we're already seeing, because it sounds really handy from what I've seen, that basically interpreters will still be, the human interpreters, but they will basically be given a hand by their AI assistant with some of the names and numbers and stuff. And I mean, why not, right? That's how I feel about it. And then when it comes to machine interpreting, I didn't have high hopes for that. I went into my research thinking, no way, that's not realistic. And then I was really surprised to find that there were some solutions that are actually really good. I mean, they can't hold a candle to human interpreters. I'm not saying that, but it's further ahead than I expected to be for certain use cases. I don't think we need to be afraid, like I said before, that AI will replace human interpreters, but in some instances, I think it's becoming a viable solution as well, which really surprised me as well.
Did you see any differences in terms of what language or what languages were involved, or was this just for English, if you can recall the details?
Well, I mean, predominantly I've seen English and German because those are my languages, so I could judge them a bit better. But it's, of course, like in most cases, they start out with the bigger languages that are more in demand because it makes more sense for your own return on investment as well. To focus on those first, thinking that people will need those the most. And at the same time, well, if you have any kind of AI machine, it needs to be trained with certain data. So it's not as common to have a lot of AI for the really rare languages because there's generally less data there. But one thing I've seen in general in the wider language industry is a trend we call data for AI services. So a lot of the language service providers in the industry, they've started to see a lot of demand for data annotation, data labeling, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a growing demand in that field, not just for language services though, but in general, for all the Internet of Things, the voice assistants from the really big companies. Yeah, AI is a big topic and it's growing to no surprise, I guess.
Yeah, there's probably a lot there we can get back to and go into more detail. Unless anybody wants to jump in right there, I'm going to hand it over to Alex. And I was just wondering whether you use any of those tools for preparation, or whether you've done any tests, like for machine interpreting or speech-to-speech translation, as we could also call it, I guess.
I think on the day-to-day, what we do use in the freelance market is definitely machine translation. Just because if you get a relatively random speech, or, you know, like some cards from the host or the moderators, and they're usually not super specific, you just put them into a machine translation real quick. You know, it's kind of the quick and dirty solution. You wouldn't necessarily fully rely on them for interpreting, but it usually is quite handy to have them on hand. When it comes to machine interpreting, I've only been privy to some demos in different scenarios, and they've always been extremely underwhelming, to be quite frank. But then also I'm thinking they probably didn't really disclose the super latest and super greatest, like a pack of interpreters. Do you know what I mean? I'm pretty sure, like, behind closed doors, or Sarah, I'm sure you also have some additional insight than just publicly available demos or webinars to the wider interpreting community. But what's out there commercially at the moment, I don't think is very intimidating. So yeah, but I am very curious about the assistant systems. So that, I think, is even in Interpret Bank, like they would offer some stuff like that. I saw on Tech Forward, I think. And that I'm kind of curious about, because that sounds handy enough where I could actually see myself getting into that. So the assistant systems, that could be pretty cool. But I haven't actually used it. I've just learned about that from a friend.
So you're talking about terminology management, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but even stuff like automatic, like name and number recognition, where it then automatically transcribes that. So stuff like that, which I wouldn't even know where to begin to enable those kinds of features in Interpret Bank, for example. But I know from your webinars that they have those types of things. So that is quite interesting. And I think that could definitely also be something where machine learning or AI could find, I don't want to say fans in the interpreting community, but possibly like a bigger audience in the interpreting community. So I think that's definitely something to keep an eye out for in the short to midterm future, I would say.
Just one quick thing, because Alex, you just said, we probably don't need to be afraid yet of AI basically taking our jobs, right?
Right.
To me, I understand that is like a natural reaction that most people are having, but to me, it's not about that. You know, I don't think it is a threat. For me, it's not part of the story, because if anything, there should be different use cases for this. I was talking to Renato actually recently also, and he said when the first machine translation was developed many, many, many years ago, that one of his colleagues also said, oh, no, our industry is over. I'm going to leave. This is it. We're going to be replaced. And he went and started working for a bank. And like 10 years later, he was replaced by an ATM. And we're still translating, I mean, I know it's not as simple, but technically it's like, you're right. The AI solutions, they can't hold the candle to humans yet. But they are very good in the sense that like in translation, they have come very far. In interpreting, they're not as far, but even there, they've started to enable communication in some use case. And there's some use cases for that where, like we said before, in those cases, maybe you wouldn't even call an interpreter. It's too expensive, it makes no sense. But at least you have some form of communication, like you said, the quick and dirty option or something, where in some cases, it's better to have some communication than no communication, And we always think of the big conferences and the prestigious stuff, whatever, those like high class things where you want the fancy stuff. But what if, there's so many everyday scenarios as well. Sometimes, where, right now, sometimes there are no interpreters, but if you could at least have something, that's still better than nothing, And in those cases, then
right.
I was surprised to see that some communication this way is already possible. It's not the same, but at the same time, it should all be about more access to communication, language access, widening that, and more like thinking of it as expanding the market, I think.
So I'm seeing some sort of reactions there from both Henry and Graham. So if you want to jump in, I want to give you the opportunity to. I mean, Graham's keeping his poker face for now, but
yeah,
I can't read his face yet.
I don't know what's happening in Graham's head.
Henry is smiling. So
there's a lot of things happening in Graham's head, always.
Sarah, you said, it's not a threat. It's not even about that. And I haven't heard the answer as to why it's not a threat. I suspect that most answers to that question actually come back to it's not a threat right now. But nobody's saying it's a threat right now. Alex, a few moments ago, talked about the short to medium term. And I think it all depends on what we mean by the short to medium term. Because as far as I'm concerned, it clearly is a threat. And depending on what you mean by the short to medium term, I think potentially in the short term, it's quite a significant threat. In fact, I don't think it's even sensible to talk about it as a threat. I think it's just inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
The rationale for that line of thinking is based simply upon turning around and looking back over your shoulder as to how quickly things have advanced. When I was an undergraduate student, I remember the linguistics profs in my department were working on very secret, very early models of artificial speech generation, recognition and generation of artificial voices. And they would play games with students by playing recordings that they'd made and inviting us to guess which member of the staff team was speaking. And then they would actually have mixed a variety of completely artificial voices in with the real ones, and we couldn't tell the difference. So this is, when was I an undergraduate student? The mid-1980s, mid to late 1980s. Now, in short to medium term, quote unquote, terms, that's 35 years ago. That's a generation. Now, to my mind, that's the short term. So in another 35 years' time, if we've come from there to where we're at now, in 35 years, where on earth are we going to be? Now, you can call that a threat if you want to. I don't think it's terribly important to think of it in those terms, as I say, precisely because I think it's just inevitable. At that speed of development, with the resources that various kinds of organizations and institutions, are now able to throw at this kind of issue, and the value that they can generate for themselves by doing so, it's not a fight worth taking on. Well,
I completely agree with what you're saying there. And yeah, the growth, like the advancement will be probably exponential, it keeps growing and growing and really, really, really fast. But I'm just thinking of, well, on the one hand, looking at how far, for example, in translation, machine translation has come. It has come really far. And in some cases, the quality is almost on par with humans. And in other cases, it has sometimes been almost better, which sounds crazy. But there have been some stats I've seen for that as well. And yet there's still human translators, So, and we're saying for interpreting, maybe in some cases, for some scenarios, maybe there will be some replacement. I look at it more from thinking that we will find more use cases where we can enable communication. So less of thinking of it as only what we know now in terms of our interpreting market, but more what else can there be? There's so much untapped where we would maybe like to have communication, but we can't have it now. Plus, add on top of that not all interpreting is just, business and conference, but there's also the hospital interpreting, for example, or interpreting when it comes to mental health and lots of areas where the interpreter even takes on another role, which I know can be controversial sometimes because interpreters are supposed to be impartial and everything and invisible, but...
Careful.
I know, well... I don't care. So whatever. We're the troublesome
terms.
Jonathan's
not here. We need somebody to be controversial every now and again.
I'm happy to volunteer anytime. But I mean, the interpreter takes on a little bit also, I think, that role when, imagining a scenario where in the hospital, it's a life and death situation or not, but you're in a foreign country, you don't speak the language, and then comes in someone who finally speaks your language and can help you, And you kind of cling on to that person as well a little bit, I imagine, This happened to me before as well as the patient. And they almost become your little confidant as well. Like a machine is not going to be that confidant for you.
Have you seen the care robots in Japan?
Yeah, I know that this kind of stuff also exists, yeah. I'm just saying I don't think it's going to be replaced in all cases. This is in a different area. I just looked into the market for American Sign Language interpreting, which is totally taken away from tech, but to illustrate the different scenarios where you use different types of interpreting. And there you have, certified deaf interpreters as well. So who are deaf individuals who are also interpreting. And not just between different sign languages, but for example, from American Sign Language to American Sign Language. So, and specifically in cases where people are more under stress, like in really stressful situations in the hospital, mental health, or with children, because in those cases you need the extra bit of care as well, the extra level of communication that, in this case, even just a deaf person can offer, because even the really good ASL interpreter in some cases then is not deemed sufficient enough, not that they're not good interpreters, but that you want that extra level of understanding from the culture and that level of connection as well. And I would imagine that similar scenarios will always apply to spoken language interpreting as well.
Right.
Now, I want to get Henry's take on the whole. Is it a threat? Is it inevitable? And so on in a minute, if that's okay. But just when I listened to Graham there, I was kind of reminded at the developments that we've seen for remote interpreting, which has been sort of dismissed out of hand for years, and it's not good enough, and it can't replace proper on-site interpreting. And then the coronavirus came along and nobody cared whether it was good enough. It was just the only available option. And I tend to agree also with the thing you mentioned, Graham, about the care robots, because sometimes it's also not about whether it's good enough or whether it's adequate. Sometimes it's just a cost issue, unfortunately, especially in healthcare. But I'd like to hear from you, Henry.
Yeah.
Because Henry's been smiling mischievously. I think he's ready to go.
No. Well, you guys know me. I mean, I'm dynamic all the time, and the care model is very interesting because I'm not seeing it as a threat in terms of, well, it depends on what are we talking about. Threat to whom and threat to what? If we are talking about us who are all established, it's not going to be a threat. But what about the next generation? When you say there's a job, what sort of a job? I mean, okay, sure, not necessarily that everybody going to be staff interpreters or staff translators. I mean, what sort of a job are we talking about in terms of remuneration, in terms of satisfaction, in terms of what actually are we contributing? I think that is actually the interesting part that I'm seeing. And because, as you know, I always trying to think about what the next generation is going to be, because the dynamics of this is fast, as Graham was saying. We don't need to look very far. Just look at how Facebook has completely changed the setup, unregulated. And the same thing applied as I wrote in the past. The idea that tech in language industry has been in our system infiltrating or affecting and creating new opportunities and destroying ones as we go, none of that is regulated. Are we seeing the consequences? Has somebody thought about the consequences? A clear question. I mean, just look at Sarah's example. If you're in a foreign hospital in the future, or I mean, it's already happening now. Would you be given an iPad? Would you be given an iPad because you're a public patient? Because if you're a private patient, you have an interpreter. Is that what's going to happen? I mean, I don't know. If that's the case, well, first of all, is it better? Is it not better? That's one question. What's the role of that? I mean, mental health. Imagine if you're trying to have a schizophrenic who's seeking mental health in a foreign country. I mean, it is even difficult to be handled by a mental health specialist interpreter, let alone by a machine. I mean, the psychiatrist will be saying, hang on, is it the machine giving me gibberish or is the patient telling me gibberish?
I think that's an excellent example.
And I think that is the really difficult part. I mean, I often talked about the reverse Turing's test. The idea is there is something wrong, right? Whose fault is it? I mean, the Turing test is easy. Can a human look at the output and say, is it human? Can I work that out? But now I'm the other way around. We have a breakdown of communication. Look at the breakdown of communication situation. What is the error here? Because now the whole tech system has been decoupled from accountability. In the past, at least you can say, oh, hang on, that's the interpreter's fault, or that is the editor's fault, or that's the copywriter's fault, or that is the printer's fault, or however that might be. This is now totally unaccountable.
Yeah, it's the black box, right?
Correct. It's a black box. So I think it's replacing what and replacing how and a threat to whom. And who's got the right to choose? Because and now this is the key, because as you know, an amateur economist, when Alex says it's all about money, it's all about budget, it is. Because why did RSI suddenly take off in that setting? Yes, sure, it's because we can't fly, it's because of budget, but has actually people been consulted? Is it going to be the new normal? Of course it's going to be a new normal because it's cheaper. Ultimately, with people actually value about because diplomacy happened. Not all diplomacy happened by Zoom. How did that work? Because special diplomats and envoys are still traveling.
It's all about the priorities.
It is. It's all about the priorities. So replacing what and replacing whom? I think Graham and I have been talking about this for quite a while, and most of us have. The driverless cars, the automated driverless cars things. If you think about the threat to our profession is not what we're talking about quite often, because we're actually looking at the wrong way. So looking at driverless cars, it's like, well, actually, that's a hype thing because people are hyping and wanting people to invest. And it's an investment issue. Is it ever going to come? I don't know. But I mean, driverless cars will come when they're only driverless cars.
If I may just jump in there real quick with the driverless cars, because I think that's a really interesting point to make, because the driverless cars, if we go back just like 5 years or whatever, the automotive manufacturers were already saying, by 2021, we'll have fully automated driving, like fully driverless cars. And the thing is, the technology isn't as far advanced as they thought it would be. However, there could be driverless cars at the moment already, but the legislation isn't advanced enough. So the thing that's currently really putting the brakes on it is because the legislators are slowing down the process because they don't know how to regulate this stuff. And I'm thinking, if, let's say in 30 years' time, machine interpreting were to be at a level where it could potentially be used at a larger scale, there could also be some legislation coming into effect here, because at the end of the day, I think if we're looking in the future, there has to be legislation kind of ruling or governing a lot of the machine to human interfacing that's going to happen, because there have to be like laws and rules in place, because as you mentioned, it's a black box. So what does the machine do? What if a machine makes a mistake, et cetera, et cetera? So there have to be rules and regulations made for all those things. And so even if the machine interpreting sort of looms large, I think if we kind of look at the autonomous driving situation, we see how that gets slowed down as well.
Okay, just a few comments on what both of you said as well. First of all, I like what you said, Henry, and Alex, I guess as well, with the money coming in, right? Because we always say at NIMSY as well that in the end, it's the market that decides. It's about the end user, it's about the consumer, it's the buyer of language services in the end. You can have the best product ever. If no one's buying it, then it's pointless, And you got to kind of bring your language, like adapt your services to the actual needs as well. So like matching up with what you said, people always said, okay, RSI isn't good enough, but well, now the market decided it is, in the sense that people were responding to it and decided it is good enough. I want to use this and not the other thing, And then the second thing with regulations, regulations are actually another really, really big driver for the demand in language services. That's why in the United States, it's such a big market, because there are laws that, you have the right to receive certain services in your native language. I think it's the same in the UK, whereas in Germany, we don't really have that, And so this really decides as well how big or not big language services are, what types of language services you can receive, because then let's say if a hospital has to provide something, or if they don't have to, that influences what type of services you get as well.
And then we come back to the care robots.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'm thinking also drawing a bit of a line again to translation. These days, like I said, machine translation is a staple, and there's actually more being translated by machines than by humans these days, if you're looking purely at the number of words, right? But there's, of course, post-editing in a lot of cases. But then there's complete sectors where machine translation is not used because, for example, it's not common to use machine translation in marketing. because you need to be a bit more creative and colorful. It's not common to use it for literature translation for fairly similar reasons, not the exact same ones, but you get the idea. I don't know, maybe the future of interpreting could also be that or human interpreting, that it's becoming more niche, that only for certain types of cases you still have a human interpreter. Whereas in other cases you have other types of language services. Actually, companies I talked to during the pandemic, there were a few who said that they did on-site interpreting before, and they said not all of that demand pivoted to remote for them, but also to like adjacent services like captions for virtual meetings or document translation. I don't know, maybe interpreters need to branch out as well. Your job changes as you go, I guess. Translators, a lot of them had to adopt post-editing as well, or I don't know. It certainly will have an effect on the industry. I just don't think that it will ever be completely replaced.
No. But we're not saying that as Graham
I'm
was
not saying you are saying that either.
We agree on that.
Sorry, I'm just clarifying my own position is all.
No. Actually, given that Graham and I are in agreement, we can finish the recording now, because that's the scopus of this is finished. But no. But actually,
just to say, Henry, I'm not sure I do agree with that actually. But continue.
Brilliant.
Okay, good, excellent. We've got a reason to carry on. But pick up on two things that have just been said, because I think that's very important. One is, yes, it is very common for tech. I mean, not that people quote Jack Ma these days, because he's now completely out of favor. But I mean, that's what they were saying. Regulation is the problem of tech, and there are no experts except experts of yesterday. Well, actually, if there are no experts of yesterday, there won't be experts of today. Let's face that. I mean, and that's the whole idea of tech actually not thinking about where did it come from. I mean, I often said, without human translators, machine translation are just formula and algorithm. I mean, that's why low resource languages don't work when it comes to this sort of thing. But anyway, let's put regulation aside, because regulation is a totally different idea. You've got a leader of your government, well, for now, for the next little while, before she retires, that actually understands science. But most politicians don't. Right? Mm-hmm. And the Congress hearing on tech and surveillance, I mean, it's just laughable. So how regulation comes in and the drivers of regulation is totally different. And it's an even bigger money issue. But put that aside, a simple, relatively linear way of looking at it. Autonomous cars, whether it will happen or not, it's a tech issue. And just look at the investment now suddenly dropped, knowing that this tech is too hard, or this tech is actually taking too much money. Flip it the other way, ignoring regulation. Planes. Autopilot is on all your planes, but it's not happening because we don't accept it, right? I took one of the first flight that went from Perth to London, 16 hours, direct flight. And they have 4 sets of pilots. That's all paid for. Because the plane can do it. We know the plane can do it. Why are we not using that? It's not a regulatory issue. Well, it is a regulatory issue, but it's also the idea of how we are going to accept that. I want to bring into that because that's why it's important in interpreting, because it's very dynamic. And Jonathan always say that this is the real world stuff. It's because if you are driving and the only way at present, or at least in the foreseeable future, autonomous cars will work is because all cars are autonomous. You can't have rebellious drivers, somebody having road rage, and the autonomous cars would just not go, or with pedestrians walking out or cats jumping out and all the rest of it. It's not that ethical issue. It's even that the technology issue. Whereas planes are different, right? Planes are all regulated. You know exactly which altitude there is. There's much less of interference and birds and all the rest of it. I mean, simplified. But we actually need to think about the dynamic side of communication. I think that is the key. Yeah. We are changing the environment. If we are adding tech, we are changing the environment. The environment of language services is already changing. We are seeing text, we're seeing speeches, we're seeing corporate guff that are actually very easily translatable.
That's an excellent point. And I want to put a pin in that real quick because I wanted to throw this to Graham, if I may, because Graham, you have quite a bit of experience, so being involved in legislative procedures with the BSL Act, and sort of what I would be interested is in getting your take in whether regulation or laws can actually do those things that some of us now alluded to, or I mean, how do you see that play out? Because sometimes, for the BSL Act, there was this legal act, and then it had to be filled with life, as it were. And did you see that happen, or did it remain more of a paper tiger, I guess, is the question in a somewhat, very short form, I guess.
I mean, I could give you a long answer to that question, but much of it is perhaps not really pertinent to our real topic here. The short answer to the question is, at this stage, then yes, it is to a significant extent just a paper tiger at this point in time. Because there was an act of the Scottish Parliament in 2015, there was a national plan published in 2017. That first national plan was due for an interim review in 2020, yes, and then COVID. So there has been no interim review, and much is, the whole thing is to some extent in suspended animation at the moment while we hope to get things back on track and so on. So it's not necessarily the best example to take. The more crucial question, I think, is about whether regulation is going to be a knockdown issue here of any kind. And to my mind, there's not the slightest chance that it will be. Because I think that our policy developers and ethicists of various kinds and so on have to handle much, much more complex issues than this, and have done so on a regular basis. We may not like the outcomes that they come up with all the time. They may still be contested, but we have rules and regulations around all kinds of things. So, for example, a few years ago, I was involved in a campaign to protest about the human fertilization and embryology bill in the UK. That's seriously complex ethical stuff. And people are still disputing whether the right, quote unquote, outcomes came out of that process, and they will do so probably until, long into the future. But there is legislation on that. Decisions have been reached about how we will go forward. Things will be disputed in the courts. We have institutions that deal with that, etc., etc. That will happen in this field too.
That kind of reminds me of the whole debate about how some clamor for more regulation of the interpreting profession, so that you need to have a certain degree to be able to work as an interpreter in the first place, that kind of thing, which could lead to regulation that we've been clamoring for, but we don't like the result in the end, as you just said, if I'm not mistaken. So it might not be, what we want in the end. But maybe we can get back to the whole question of dynamism, and it seems to me like it's a little bit similar to what you've been saying, Sarah, is that interpreting could go niche, or maybe it could go premium, or maybe that's the same thing. I don't know.
So I'm wondering if nice. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the question, because niche and premium is not necessarily the same. Niche could also mean it's a rare language. Yeah, and premium, it's just about the price and who can afford it, and that's not necessarily the same thing. So
true. Good point, actually.
Because I really like the whole aspect, the whole question around language access, but I'm wondering whether we are really going to see that, or whether it's just going to be pushing down prices and rates and people making do with lower quality. I mean, we haven't really gotten into the whole quality issue yet. I don't know if we want to, but I don't know, Henry, if you wanted to go into more detail on what exactly you mean by that dynamism. Are you talking about sort of the messiness of human communication? Or?
So let's pick up on what Sarah's saying. Sarah's saying that, we need to be more flexible, we need to change, we need to actually look at the future and so on. I totally agree with that, because, we come from a second oldest profession and, yes, but back in my day, I have to do this. No, fine. But on the other hand, there's also an implication issue. Professions are getting harder and harder to be established, and harder to actually say the next 10 years is going to be, or the next 50 years, or the next lifetime of somebody's earning the income is going to be secure. That is much harder, even in established services, let alone for us. But the problem for me is that I don't like the term AI because, when I was at university, as Graham was saying, when I was at university, those things are called stochastic methods. It's not AI. There's nothing artificial or nothing intelligent about it. It's just stochastic methods of actually solving a problem. But now it's been marketed as an AI. But anyway, be that as it may, any profession needs investment from individuals and from the people using it. Clear and simple. So the question for that is, looking at people who are actually in a multilingual setting, and I'm involved in an indigenous world, and deaf world is in a different sense because of the regulatory pressure and so on. But telling people to say, oh, you're talented, you could be an interpreter or you could be a translator. Is that happening? No, because they will be going, I will be coding. I would be doing whatever interesting thing it might be. And the interest is not there. And if this is turning into a precarious situation, it is much harder to ask people to invest in the huge amount of time and the resources to be able to get to where we are, let alone better than who we are. And I think that's a problem. The problem for tech is that it's a little bit like, but not the same. When I was at EST in Aarhus, a conference on translation studies, I said, if we are actually promoting all this idea of an industry that's changing and that is actually getting, automated and so on, there won't be any students in 30 years because nobody will want to study translation. There will be no translation studies. So we need to change that idea because the same idea of tech, the more we are automating, either it has to be self-perpetuating, which is very dangerous, but let's not go there. Where's the next generation of experts going to come from?
So you're saying we have an image problem, or the profession kind of feels outdated?
Well, we always have an
image
problem.
Compared to the shiny tech companies.
A new image problem.
Well, it's an image problem on various levels because, yes, just by saying, interpreters are not going to die, the profession is not going to die, translator is not going to die. Sure, but in what form? And is it attractive to the next generation? And is it attractive to actually allow people to actually come into the profession that will actually reinvigorate it in a way that we want to see?
I think that's an excellent point.
That is the dynamism that's changing. But the other dynamism is, people laugh about translationese, but actually we are generating texts. European Union would know that. You're generating texts that are machine translatable. Soon we will be talking machine interpretable. Now, is that what we want?
I'm trying to think what to. I'm processing everything that Henry so brilliantly outlined there, and I think you make some excellent points and a lot of good food for thought. I'm kind of, I don't know. I keep thinking, what about in relation to this image problem? I actually agree with you, Henry. That's a good point. Like, how do you get people then to study translation and interpreting to become the next experts there as well? Well, what if in these courses, or what about embracing tech more than in those fields? I know, for example, when I did my interpreting degree, we already also started interpreting from some videos as well. It wasn't live, but from some videos as well for practice. Or when I did translation as well, there was some working with trados or something like that. Even though, to be honest, in my translation degree, we had to handwrite everything on paper. I was also thinking, well, that's kind of far away from reality,
How quaint.
Why not bring it closer to how translators actually work? But okay, doesn't matter. I don't know. And this is just top of my head, but if there's more of a future in it with also presenting it in that way, that it's not, if you do, maybe it's not like pure human translation or pure human interpreting what you're studying, but like a mix of, there's some role that you play as the human. In other cases, there's more the tech side, and that you're embracing this to something new. I don't have an answer, obviously. I'm totally rambling here, but just wondering with the image problem you said as well, if that's a way to solve it, instead of resisting and trying to push it away,
Just one very quick comment, because otherwise it becomes a monologue. I've always talked about the fact that actually what we see throughout history, what is translation and what is interpreting, is only a very narrow scope of intercultural communication and interlingual communication. We all know that. And forgive me if I'm wrong. The current literature hit is all about re-speaking and trans-speaking and all the dynamic audiovisual translation and so on. That's very exciting. But then the question is, how are you going to train the next generation of people who are actually going going to be doing that? Because at the moment, the people who are actually doing them are simultaneous interpreters, are translators, are audiovisual translators who are already retraining or taking their skills to a new level or to a different platform to be working on tech, to be working on accessibility. But the real question for me, it's not about our market. Our market is gigantic.
Yes.
We're not actually even touching the aspect of our market. So to say that it is a threat because the market is a zero-sum game, I don't think so. But the problem is how to actually generate the interest to actually fulfill our real mission of being communication experts.
How to train the next generation. The market is changing so quickly and you don't have the teachers for that yet. I think that's a problem anyway, right? Not just in language studies, but in university.
Perfect for Graham, I think. Graham to answer that as a pedagogist.
I don't mean any offense. Basically, my family are all teachers, pretty much, with exception of my dad, who's an architect. But it's just full of teachers. So no offense to teachers, I just mean I'm just saying it's often a little bit behind if you, of course, first have to study something and then you teach it. And then that time the market has moved on. At the same time, especially in universities, I know there are people who have worked on the market or are working on the market. And again, my interpreting studies, all of our teachers were active on the market, but I'm saying oftentimes in academia and in schools, that is exactly the problem that you're saying, Henry, right? Or you as well, Graham. Things are developing so quickly. It's hard to, catch up and prepare the next generation for what's lying ahead, no?
I mean, I've come in there just to say, as the baldest man in the room, I feel able to say that I fear, unfortunately, that a lot of this conversation sounds to me like bald men fighting over a comb.
Okay.
Because, as I said earlier, I still think that I haven't heard any argument that really persuades me that, the shift that we started out thinking about towards machine-delivered interpreting is anything but inevitable. And I think we're talking about, but it'll be complex to regulate. Yes, but not impossible. Yes, but it's a very difficult challenge. Yes, but it's not an impossible one, and the machines are getting cleverer. Yes, but the market will grow. Yeah, the market will grow, but it will be satisfied by the cheapest possible solution, and the cheapest possible solution will be an AI-driven solution. If there were a market in machine translation for social media messages, that's one of the areas where more and more translation has happened over recent years. We're all routinely using it.
Yeah.
None of that's being done by human beings. So it's the machines that are lapping up the extra work, and I think that'll only continue. There will be some niches that will take longer to fill, but the smarter the machines get, the more data gets poured into the hoppers, the faster the answers will get generated, etc., etc. So unfortunately, I think we're guilty really of just not looking quite far enough ahead. I think if one looks 50 years ahead, let's say, for the sake of argument, a couple more generations, to me, youngsters coming into the schools now and opting against studying languages because they think there's not going to be work in translation and interpreting are simply making entirely rational decisions about that. If what they were studying languages for, were to get employment in those professions, I think there are lots and lots of other good reasons to study language and culture, don't get me wrong.
Yep.
But for translation and interpreting purposes, I think they're just making a rational decision if they say there's not a long-term career in this for me. And if not the current young generation, then I reckon certainly the next one, 20, 30 years' time. I think we probably really just have to lift our heads up a little bit and say, okay, well, there are plenty of other important things that we could be doing with our ideas and with our languages and with our skills and with our pattern recognition abilities and all the rest of it that's underpinning the kinds of works that we do. How can we deploy those in innovative and dynamic ways to address the colossal problems that our societies face over the coming century? This is not one of those colossal problems, it seems to me. This is one that is on its way towards us finding very smart tools that will handle this adequately for human purposes.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you see any differences there across languages? And most importantly, what about sign language? Same judgment there, or?
As Sarah said, where we're talking about less widely used languages, smaller communities, and so on, the process will be perhaps slower in some respects, but the same steps are going to be taken. And essentially that applies to sign languages as well. Mm-hmm. So right now there are some pretty clever, pretty credible kinds of avatars being produced that can, looking increasingly natural and increasingly like human signers. They're not there yet, but as I've said throughout this conversation, I think, when we talk about the yet part, we're just not looking quite far enough ahead. I think that's the case with these kinds of avatars as well. And, the resources that are needed for creating and, more importantly, perhaps reading sign language in a machine-driven way are less widely available at the moment. But again, they are being developed. They are evolving faster than we can blink, more or less. And, in the case of dealing with visual information, digital visual information, most of this is happening completely out with the language field. It's happening, for example, through, CGI for films and so on. And all of that will wash back into industries like ours in due course, more or less as an afterthought, because they don't generate as much money as something like blockbuster films do.
That's a good point, actually.
It looks like Alex is rethinking his life choices there.
No, not at all.
Probably reevaluating options there.
No, not at all. It's just interesting taking in all the different sides. And I think what Graham was saying as well, it's just it's tough looking far enough into the future, because at some point we're trying to look like around
Humans
the curve.
Are bad at that. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, we're not.
Yeah.
Yeah, on that, actually, I also want to say about the, saying that the market is expanding. And you were saying, Graham, it will be filled with more machines. And you're probably right, ultimately. But again, I was more looking at the more immediate future. When I was saying the market is expanding, I mean more that, for example, scenarios where there is no interpreting yet, that some of that will be filled with some machine interpreting or some remote, RSI found a whole lot of new section of buyers of interpreting now, that didn't buy interpreting services before. So it didn't take away.
This is now cheap.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I was talking about in terms of expanding there as well, with not only in this case, of course, but it comes with new opportunities as well for the interpreting market, is what I'm saying.
Let me just jump in here real quick, because I remember it was about like a year ago that we talked to Lakshman Ratnam.
Yeah,
I think it was about like June or July last year that we talked to him about machine interpreting. Mm-hmm. And we had this is kind of always like how the circle goes, right? We had the same conversation about RSI year after year after year until the bubble burst, and all of a sudden there was RSI. And so we talked to him about the same thing, that it was going to expand sort of language access, and it was kind of like going to open doors, because the quality of machine interpreting wasn't going to be properly right at the beginning, but then it kind of raises awareness for language access, which opens doors for us. And I think it's kind of like a similar discussion that we're having right here at the moment. I'm struggling, Graham, to see where we're going to be. I agree what Sarah is saying. There is going to be more language access across the board. And I agree with what you're saying as well, is that wherever it's feasible and cheaper, and obviously it's going to be cheaper wherever it's feasible, we're going to be replaced by interpreting. But I don't see any future, unless there's like C3PO walking into the door right now, where we're actually going to be replaced across the board by machines. I just don't see that happening, even 50, 60, 70 years in the future. I just don't see that happening. And it's been said here tonight that it might mean that interpreting or conference interpreting or whatever type of interpreting we're talking about becomes more niche, becomes more sort of like boutique.
Can you say more about why you don't see it happening, Alex?
So I was just thinking, so I do a lot of motivational interpreting, right? A lot of motivational speaking, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very fast, very slang. And also you have to really bring the motivation, like the emotional beats, you have to bring that into the other language. And even if a machine were able to compute all of the input, the output just wouldn't be the same, because even in like 30, 40, 50 years, a machine is not going to be able to perfectly replicate the emotional impact of a motivational speech from one language to the other. I just don't see that happening unless C3PO comes into the door right now and, you know, he's the ultimate interpreter across all languages. I just don't see that happening. But again, maybe I'm just not looking far ahead enough around the curve into the future. I don't know, Graham, convince me I'm wrong.
So if I understand your example, you're saying the motivational impact of a speech, for example.
For example.
The machine interpreted "I have a dream" speech, for instance.
Yes, if we will. Yeah, sure.
Honestly, I don't see what is. I think it's just decline, isn't it? From the simplest two-word utterances of a tiny child to Martin Luther King, and it's just a question of whether we have enough data and enough capability, sensitivity in our machine processes, our machine-driven processes, to handle more and more complex material. And as I said earlier, I think, the evidence, if you look back over your shoulder, is precisely that, human abilities have demonstrated that in tandem with digital processes, one way or another, they have found their way to handle more and more and more and more complex material, and they will continue to do so. So I think, the same kinds of underlying processes that now enable machine translation to produce a very credible "I have a dream" speech in writing, I see absolutely no reason why they can't do exactly the same with the spoken word.
So in terms of emphasis and pathos, if you will, I would probably agree in that might be an option. Sure, why not? Yeah.
And I agree with Graham. Being the Cassandra in the room often, because I predict dystopic futures, that's terrible. People go, oh my God, but nobody listens. I mean, just look at all the fake videos that's been coming out. I mean, this is only at the beginning, and it's already affecting how people behave. So this is rudimentary. It's not very hard to manipulate people's emotions. That's one thing. Using machine to manipulate emotions is not difficult. Using machine to generate impact, to generate empathy might be harder, but impact certainly.
Disinformation.
Disinformation. I mean, that's all happening already. And that's all happening translingually or through different language medium. It's already happening. The dystopic part is this. At the moment, we have the tier level. We have the very high level interpreting that we can hear, that we can actually go, this is really different, and this is something that machine cannot imitate yet. There is actually a mathematical point of inflection that will come through eventually, as what Graham is saying. It's not necessarily linear, I agree, because look at what happened in the past. People were saying that ELF, English as lingua franca, will actually take over the world. Well, it actually hasn't, but, that's an aside.
Not yet, maybe.
But it's not necessarily linear. But as we go up that scale, we will also have a downscale of expectation. Because the downscale of expectation is this. Unfortunately, one day, all of the expert will die, and there will be a new generation of expert that may or may not be as good as. And eventually, we will actually approach the asymptote, where the machine and the human actually intersect. And that's the dystopic side.
I was just thinking about Ray Kurzweil. These predictions about 2045 is the date he gives.
For the singularity?
For the singularity, for, human knowledge and machine knowledge attaining such a pitch that, boom, all sorts of things become possible. 2045, that's 24 years.
Not very far away.
Yeah. Absolutely around the corner. Now, I'm not saying every word that comes out of Ray Kurzweil's mouth is bound to be true.
Sure.
But he's a smart guy. He's got a handle on a whole lot of knowledge that the rest of us, can only dream of having access to, kind of thing. And I think Henry makes an important point there about these two kind of intersecting directions, as it were. Because the other part of all of this, I think, and it does come back to something that we've sort of acknowledged as an elephant that we don't necessarily want to pet within this room, about quality, because I think it's already surely true for us all that we are more tolerant of less high quality translations than we would have been a few years ago. We see them all the time. We live with them. We don't stress about them. Kids text messages to each other. They spell everything wrong. They can't be bothered with the capital letters. They don't care.
Not just kids.
Communication still seems to be happening. They still manage to form human relationships and all the rest of it. Academics who, a number of them, an increasing number of them, linguists who are saying, okay, I'm going to live with the variation that we all see around us in academic writing and so on, and I'm not going to correct my students' English in this, that, and the other respect, because we're just all more tolerant of this kind of variation now. So I think that's one part of the intersection that Henry's talking about. We are well on the way already to learning to live with different kinds of expectations around language and communication in that respect too.
Yeah, we're getting dangerously close to the precipice of doom and gloom. It feels like, but I mean, it was interesting that Henry mentioned the what was it, the inverted Turing test or the reverse Turing test. We could talk about
the inverse Turing test. Yeah,
inverse Turing test. We could talk about blind faith and machine translation. The story of police officers knocking down a door because they were working with wrong assumptions due to false machine translation. So I'm not sure we want to take further steps towards the precipice. So maybe we can sort of circle back to what Sarah was getting at earlier and talk about what's maybe the better alternative. I mean, what are ways and means to put our skills to good use, as you said, Graham, if in fact machine translation or the singularity is inevitable?
Just to sort of contest the way you framed that very slightly, I don't think it is necessarily to see it as a precipice. You could say it's just a very sane refocusing of our attention on the things that really are going to matter, in the years ahead. And if this is not going to be one of them, why would we focus lots and lots of our attention and anxiety and concern on it, and brain power?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because again, it's not interpreting for interpreting's sake or translating for translation's sake, right? Yeah. But yeah, just for people who have these skills, and like you said, there's lots of transferable skills that you gain as a translator and an interpreter that you can use in other fields, and lots of us have other interests as well. So you can go into other directions. But yeah, I know, Graham, like I said, I'm putting you on the spot, but off the top of your head, what are some of the other more important things we could be focusing our attention on with those skills, for example, if you know any?
I mean, we've touched in passing on things like the growth of disinformation, and I think allied to that, seems to me, in the wider society is a level of intolerance in many respects that people are encountering in many of their human-to-human interactions. And for me, learning about other languages, learning about other communities, learning about other cultures is the way par excellence of learning tolerance. And I think that is going to be a human skill that we clearly are going to need to work on in the society that is now emerging ahead of us. Languaging and understanding language processes as a way of building human relationships seems to me to be absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. So I think if we are able to reframe some of the kinds of things that we do towards those kinds of exercises of intercultural encounter, an inter-community encounter, whether that's within one and the same language or across languages. And in essence, if the machines are doing the translation for you, in other words, if you've got a Babel fish in your ear, then we might as well be speaking the same language anyway.
Yeah. I like what you're saying there. It actually reminds me of, I seen a brief clip a while back from I forgot his name, unfortunately, but a well-known, successful business guy. I'm just going to say, I really cannot recall the name. I can probably find the video later and put it in the notes somewhere. But I remember he was talking also about how, we shouldn't try to compete with the machines because the machines will ultimately win, but that instead we should focus on what makes us human, what we humans bring to the table, like you said. And then, for example, in schools, people should maybe also focus on teaching children empathy and the power of empathy. And like you said, maybe, focusing on tolerance and overcoming those wider issues, exactly like you said, the bigger human issues that we're facing.
Yeah, I think empathy is a key word. Thank you.
And that's very hard to put a value on. And that's very hard to convince people to be actually investing in. Just picking up on that idea, not to take us to the precipice, but to remind or at least highlight the fact that there is a double-edged sword. There's always a double-edged sword. Technology is a double-edged sword, just like language is a double-edged sword. There is a flip side. The idea, the interesting discussion about premium and niche was interesting because, Sarah talked about marketing. The idea of marketing not being used in machine translation. Well, yes and no. It's only a conceptual issue. Because actually, a lot of disinformation is generated by machine translation. Well, actually, a lot of disinformation is generated by humans. Let's not forget that there are many countries in the world that train translators to provide disinformation. But that's something that we in the European society don't think about. I was talking to John Jameson not too long ago. We've lost the ability to think about the fact that information was a weapon.
Yeah.
That language was a weapon. We've lost it. In the Cold War, we were thinking exactly the same thing as the other side. But now we have 50 years, 60 years, 70 years of peace. We've completely forgotten about it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I was just going to say that in Europe, it's not like maybe we don't think about it anymore, even though I feel like it's coming back a little bit with all the movements we're seeing, also in Europe. But yeah, of course, if you think in World War II, then followed by the Cold War and everything, there, like you said, language was a major weapon, and there was lots of disinformation. So I think I said this before as well, that there's some ways where machines are being used for disinformation, but humans have been used for that for way longer. So, that's that. And circling back to the whole thing with empathy as well, I think that these kind of soft skills, they have been underestimated for a really, really, really long time. It's still seen as like, that's nice, whatever, but what are the harder skills that you can bring to the table? Whereas really it's the soft skills that, where we as humans can excel, and that should be brought to the forefront more.
But I guess the question is, do soft skills pay the rent? I mean,
well, maybe
a lot
in the
of us
future
think
will,
one of
if
you...
the machines take over the other jobs,
I think we just have a hard time imagining what that looks like. But go ahead, Graham.
If you go back to Henry's point about language as a weapon, I find that hard to square with the notion that this is a soft skill.
Good point.
It's a very powerful skill,
Yes.
Extremely powerful skill. And my children are now 26 and 22. My wife is an interpreter as well. And, we always said through those children's schooling, the number one skill, the number one capability that we wish their education would focus on would be critical discourse analysis.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
And so again, in terms of, skills that are of real value in the long term to the human race, I think critical discourse analysis would be pretty high up my list.
Yeah, I could not agree more.
And it's exactly to counter language as a weapon, to counter disinformation, and to think straight using language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes to everything you said there, Graham.
Yes, and they're transferable. It's totally transferable skill, which is what Graham's point, and I totally agree. It's that we need to be able to make what we do sexy, but the sexy part is that actually all we do is very transferable, whether it is in journalism, whether it is in translation, whether it is in diplomacy, whether it's in any human encounter. Of course we do, because otherwise we cannot attract the new generation, the new experts. Yes, income matters, but we'd also need to say, but how does income matter depends on how we value the society. It's all about how we put value on. Who's being remunerated? How are people how is society being remunerated? But that's too philosophical, maybe.
But that's really the big question. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I'm not sure that we need to make it sexy, though, Henry, do we? We just need to get people to recognise that it is as important as breathing, for Pete's sake. If empathy and thinking straight are not as important as breathing, I don't know why we would do them. And I would go back, comment Sarah made earlier. She talked about when she was studying translation, they were made to handwrite everything. Was handwriting sexy for us when we were at school? No. It was just something that you absolutely had to do.
Yes, I went through penmanship. I mean, I had to learn how to write, and having had a colonial education, penmanship and articulation, that was the thing that we had to do. The reason why I talk about sexiness, or maybe it's a wrong term, is this. At the moment, I'm trying to work on the issue of indigenous languages and the rarer languages. Sign language is a little bit different in the sense of the accessibility side is different. But if you think about how do we revive dialects, how do we revive languages that are not popular, a huge part of it is because employment opportunities. A second part of it is stigmatism. I mean, classic example, because I'm talking through three people in the German-speaking world. The classic example between the North and South. I go to Zurich and people speak to me in Schweizerdeutsch. They're proud to speak to me in Schweizerdeutsch. And they go, this is my language. I don't care what you think. Why? Because they're rich, sure. But it's also because it's also because they are really proud of that. Their children are really proud of that. Everyone's really proud of that. And then I go north. Friends of mine who are up north, they go, oh, we don't speak dialect. That's that's a terrible thing. In order for this to work, in order for language to work, same thing as in order for humanities to work, in order for all the soft skills, as whatever we want to call it, to be attractive, we want to make it attractive. We want to highlight the attractiveness. I think that's why I call it sexy. That's why I call it sexy. It's probably the wrong term. But if we make it compulsory, all we do is antagonize. Because that's what happened, like handwriting. If we make something compulsory, most children will go, why do I have to learn that? I don't want to do that.
Well, like you said, you can make it attractive even if it's on the curriculum, right? I mean,
sure, absolutely. I mean, but not necessarily compulsion.
I'm not an Irish speaker, but I lived in Ireland for a long time. And I know the language was, pretty much almost dead. And now it's kind of coming back. And for a very long time, there was a stigma associated with speaking Irish, that it's the language of the poor and that's lower class. And now it's coming back and people take more pride in speaking Irish as well. So there is a little bit of that, image around it as well, and attractiveness,
it's definitely
of course.
Sexy, yeah.
When it comes to dialects, so I think we kind of tend to say that in Germany, we're no longer, patriots, but we're regional patriots. I don't associate with the whole being German thing, but I love the area that I'm from, and I love our dialect. And I love coming home and speaking my dirty dialect, and I will defend it to anyone. Dirty dialect. Yeah, because our dialect here is known as being very trashy, but I love it, and I'm very proud of it and everything it represents. So
it's really, really funny to see that as the conversation progresses, we sort of keep poking at bigger and bigger topics, but maybe this is a good opportunity to wrap up for today and maybe say that we continue another time if you agree. In a pub, ideally, yeah.
And,
maybe
live
with a few more people.
With audience. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
Exactly.
A live pub show. I love it.
With a very interactive audience. Yeah, I've really taken away a lot from this conversation and liked what Graham, for example, said earlier with putting these things to good use, and maybe not looking at whether they're marketable first, but whether they're of benefit to humanity, I guess, made me think of things like the universal basic income. But again, poking at yet another big topic we could get into, but probably won't get into. So I guess for tonight, thank you so much, Graham and Henry, for coming on and talking to us about all these topics. We've kind of moved away from technology along the way. But I think it's been a worthwhile discussion.
Telling in itself, we've refocused on the human side and what we bring to the table.
Exactly, and I'd be very interested.
Tool. It's how to use it.
Yeah,
it's the same thing as all we're talking about. The theme today is actually it's how to use the tools, really, or how to equip the user. Well, anyway.
Actually, yeah, exactly.
And cut that out. Cut that out.
I'm also very interested in hearing from our listeners, and feel free to write in or send us voice messages, and just give us your take on the whole topic of the future of the profession, I guess, to sound a bit grandiose. But once again,
just in a short post.
Exactly, very quick. Thanks for joining us. It's been a wonderful discussion, and again, I really hope we can continue it at some point live.
Yes, thank you so much.
But for now, we'll sign off and say thank you for listening.